I was still wearing my black dress, the one I had bought 2 days earlier because I did not own anything dark enough for a funeral, when I heard my mother-in-law laughing in my own kitchen. Not a soft laugh. Not the kind you let slip accidentally when grief makes you delirious. It was a full, relaxed, comfortable laugh, the kind she reserved for Sunday brunches and charity galas, the kind that meant she was completely at ease. My husband had been in the ground for exactly 4 hours. My name is Serena. I am 31 years old, and until 8 months ago, I was a forensic auditor for a mid-sized financial consulting firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. I say until 8 months ago because that is when everything about my life changed. Not because of the funeral, not because of what happened in my kitchen that afternoon, but because of what my husband had quietly built for us in secret over the better part of a decade, and what I was holding in my hands inside a sealed envelope from his estate attorney when I walked through my own front door and heard that laugh. Let me back up. My husband James was 40 years old when he died. A pulmonary embolism. No warning, no symptoms that any of us recognize as symptoms. He was healthy, he exercised, he did not smoke. The doctors told me it just happened sometimes, and that sentence has haunted me every single night since. He died on a Tuesday morning at Atrium Health, and by Thursday we had buried him in a plot he had apparently already purchased for himself 2 years prior. Because James was the kind of man who thought about things like that quietly and handled them without telling you. That should have been my first clue that there was a great deal James had handled quietly. His estate attorney, a calm woman named Miss Holt, who wore small gold earrings and spoke in measured sentences, had called me the morning of the funeral and asked if I could stop by her office before going to the reception. I thought it was routine. I thought she needed my signature on something administrative, a bank account transfer, a car title, whatever widows sign in the first week. I sat in her office in my funeral dress with my mascara already gone, and she slid a document across the desk and told me to take my time reading it. I was still processing the first page when she said, quietly, that the total liquid assets held in trust were just over $4.2 million, and that the investment portfolio James had built over the last 11 years, primarily in index funds and a handful of commercial real estate partnerships across the Southeast, was currently valued at just under $9 million. She even told me about the warehouse property outside of Raleigh. James had purchased it 6 years ago as part of a small LLC he had quietly formed with a college friend. His share had appreciated significantly. It was now worth approximately $2.8 million on the current market. I remember staring at the document and not being able to feel my hands. James was an operations manager at a logistics company. He earned a good salary, and we lived a comfortable life, but not a lavish one. We had a nice house in a good neighborhood. We drove reasonable cars. We cooked dinner at home most nights and took one real vacation a year. I had no idea. I genuinely had no idea. Miss Holt explained that James had structured everything inside a revocable trust that transferred entirely and automatically to me upon his death. No probate. No waiting period. The trust was mine, fully and legally, as of the moment he died. She handed me a sealed envelope and told me it contained a letter James had written for me to read at home. I walked to my car in a parking lot and sat there for 11 minutes before I could drive. By the time I reached my house, the reception was already in full swing. I had told my mother-in-law, Patricia, that she could use the house for the reception because she had asked, and I had not had the emotional bandwidth to say no. The driveway was lined with cars. I could see through the front window that the living room was full of people. I came in through the side door off the garage because I wanted 30 seconds of quiet before I had to be a gracious widow again. That is when I heard the kitchen. Patricia's voice first, then her sister, my aunt-in-law Helen, then a third voice I recognized after a moment as my brother-in-law Scott, James's older brother. I stood in the narrow hallway between the garage door and the kitchen, still holding the envelope from Ms. Holt, and I listened. She has no idea what she's doing, Patricia said. I heard the unmistakable clink of wine glasses. She was completely dependent on James for everything. She can barely manage her own checking account. That was a lie, and she knew it. I had a graduate degree in accounting, but I kept listening. The house alone is worth $500,000, Scott said, and she cannot afford to maintain it on her salary. She's going to need help, real help. Which is why we need to move quickly, Helen said. before she gets emotionally attached to the idea of keeping it and digs in. She's grieving. She's not thinking straight. Scott, did you bring the paperwork? It's in my bag. I had Dale draft it last night. Dale was Scott's personal attorney. I knew Dale. I had sat next to him at James's company Christmas party 2 years ago and found him deeply unpleasant. It's a simple family trust restructuring, Scott continued. Given that James died without a formal estate plan, but he did have a formal estate plan, I said. The kitchen went silent so completely that I could hear the refrigerator hum. I stepped around the corner. The three of them were standing around my kitchen island with their wine glasses and a manila folder that Scott was now pressing flat against the granite with both palms as though he could make it disappear through the counter. Patricia's face had gone through approximately 4 emotions in 2 seconds and settled on something attempting to look like warm concern. "Serena," she said, opening her arms. "Sweetheart, we didn't hear you come in." "I know," I said. I was calm. I was so calm it surprised even me. But I had spent 6 years as a forensic auditor, which means I had spent 6 years sitting across tables from people who were lying to me about money and learning to keep my face completely neutral while I took notes. Whatever I was feeling, I put it somewhere small and quiet inside my chest, and I left it there. "I just came from James's estate attorney," I said. "He had a very thorough estate plan. Everything is already in order." Scott and Helen exchanged a look. Patricia recovered first. "Of course," she said, her voice shifting into something softer and more careful. "We just want to make sure you're protected, honey. James would have wanted us to look out for you. Your family." "I appreciate that," I said, "but I'm fine. I need to go change my clothes." I walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs, and I sat on the edge of my bed with the sealed envelope in my lap for a long time. Then I opened it. James's handwriting was small and precise the way it always was. He had written 4 pages. I am not going to share all of it because it was private and it was the last thing my husband ever said to me, and some things belong only to the people they were meant for. But I will tell you this. He had known for a while that something was wrong with his health, something he had dismissed and not mentioned because he did not want to worry me, and in those pages he explained everything he had built, why he had built it, and what he wanted me to do with it. He told me to trust Miss Holt. He told me to trust myself. He told me not to let anyone make me feel small. And then, in his last paragraph, he wrote something I read 3 times before I understood it. He told me that Scott had approached him 14 months ago about a business investment opportunity and that James had declined. He told me that Scott had not taken the decline well. He told me that Scott had made comments in the months after that James had tried to dismiss but could not fully forget. Comments about what would happen to James's money if something ever happened to James. Comments that had struck James as just wrong enough to prompt him to make sure that every single asset he owned was locked inside that trust with my name on it, airtight, before anything could happen. James had been protecting me before he even knew he needed to. I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in the small fireproof lockbox in my closet. Then I washed my face, changed my clothes, and went back downstairs to the reception. For the next 3 hours, I was a perfectly gracious widow. I thanked people for coming. I accepted casseroles. I hugged Patricia every time she initiated it, which was often, and which I now understood to be performance rather than comfort. I watched Scott work the room, shaking hands, standing close to people, laughing just a little too easily for a man at his brother's funeral reception. He slipped the manila folder back into his bag when he thought I wasn't looking. 2 days later, Scott showed up at my door alone. He was wearing a blazer over a button-down, which was his version of business casual, and he had the manila folder under his arm. He had texted me that morning to say he wanted to check in, make sure I was doing okay, and I had said, sure, come by at 2, because I wanted to see exactly what he was going to say. I let him in and offered him coffee, which he accepted, and we sat at the kitchen table and I let him go through about 4 minutes of genuine-sounding concern for my well-being before he opened the folder. "I've been talking to Dale," he said, "and I think there's a smarter way to handle James's assets than just leaving everything in a standard trust in your name." "What kind of smarter way?" I asked. "A family protection trust," he said. "It's a restructuring. Essentially, because James died without children, there's a legal argument that his estate should have broader family consideration. This document would bring Mom into the management structure as a co-trustee. It would give her a voice in major financial decisions, which honestly I think James would have wanted. He was devoted to her. He slid the document across the table. I looked at it. I am a forensic auditor. I had been one for 6 years. I read the document the way I read every document that crosses my desk, which is to say carefully, sequentially, and with full attention to what it was actually saying rather than what someone was telling me it said. What it actually said was that signing it would dissolve James's existing trust structure and replace it with a new one in which Patricia would serve as a co-trustee with equal authority over asset management, investment decisions, and distribution. What it also said, buried in Section 9, was that in the event of trustee disagreement regarding asset liquidation, the matter would default to arbitration, and the named arbitrator was Dale. It was not a family protection trust. It was a mechanism for Patricia and Scott to access and control James's estate with Dale as their built-in tiebreaker. I set the document down. I need to have my attorney review this before I sign anything, I said. Scott's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, he said. That's completely reasonable. I just want you to know, Serena, this isn't about money. This is about making sure Mom feels included. She lost her son. The least we can do is make sure she has some visibility into how his legacy is managed. It was a good line. He had clearly practiced it. I understand, I said. I'll be in touch. He left, and the moment his car turned out of my neighborhood, I called Ms. Holt. She had already anticipated something like this. James, she told me, had specifically flagged Scott and Patricia in the trust documentation as individuals who should not be granted trustee authority under any circumstances. She said James had been very clear about it and very calm when he said it, which somehow made it worse and better at the same time. The trust is airtight, she told me. There is no legal mechanism by which they can compel you to restructure it without your consent. The document Scott gave you is completely voluntary. You never have to sign it. I know, I said. I just wanted to hear you confirm it. What I did not tell Ms. Holt yet was what I was already thinking about. Because there is a difference between protecting yourself legally and actually understanding the full scope of what you are dealing with. I had spent 6 years finding the stories that numbers tell when people do not want you to hear them. And I was starting to suspect that Scott's interest in James's estate was not just opportunistic grief. It felt more practiced than that. It felt like a plan that had been in motion for a while. I started quietly, in the evenings after work, while I was supposed to be doing all the things a new widow does, organizing, sorting, notifying. I was also pulling every piece of public financial information I could find connected to Scott's name. Property records, business filings, court documents, things that are available to anyone who knows where to look, which forensic auditors do. What I found was not subtle once you saw it. Scott had started a real estate holding company 4 years ago. On paper, it looked like a modest operation, a few residential rental properties in the greater Charlotte area. But the business filings told a different story. The company had taken out a series of short-term commercial loans over the past 2 years, each one larger than the last. Each one secured against properties that were carrying valuations I could not reconcile with comparable sales in those neighborhoods. The loans were not from a major bank. They were from a private lending firm I'd never heard of, which was itself registered in Delaware under a name that resolved to a shell entity when I traced it. Someone had been inflating asset values to secure loans from what was essentially his own shell company. The money was cycling. It was not sophisticated. It was actually rather sloppy, the kind of thing that survives as long as no one looks directly at it. Scott was cash poor and debt heavy, and had been for at least 2 years. And 14 months ago, he had gone to his brother for a large investment, and James had said no. And now James was gone, and there was a trust worth several $1,000,000 with my name on it, and Scott had shown up at my door 4 days after the funeral, with a document designed to give him a hand on the lever. I compiled everything into a clean digital file and I sent it to Mizzy Holt with a note that said, "I think we need to talk about more than estate management." She called me within the hour. 2 weeks passed. I went to work. I answered messages. I had dinner with a friend who did not ask me about money or assets or family trusts, and I was so relieved I almost cried at the table. I let Scott text me twice about whether I had reviewed the document, and I replied each time that I was still waiting on my attorney, which was partially true because Miss Holt and I were in the process of doing something specific, and I needed it to be finished before I did anything else. What we were doing was this. Miss Holt had a contact at the North Carolina Secretary of State's office and another at the State Banking Commission. I had compiled a detailed forensic summary of Scott's business filings. Together, we had built a referral package, clean, documented, sourced entirely from public records and my own professional analysis, and we had quietly submitted it to the Financial Crimes Unit at the State Attorney General's office. We did not call Scott. We did not warn anyone. We just filed the paperwork and waited. Scott called me on a Wednesday evening, 3.5 weeks after the funeral. He was not using his careful voice anymore. "I need to know where you stand on the trust restructuring," he said. "Mom is getting upset. She feels like you're shutting her out of James's legacy. You need to understand, Serena, that if you continue to refuse to cooperate, we are going to have to explore our legal options." "What legal options?" I asked. "Theo thinks there's an argument for a family claim on the estate based on James dying without direct heirs. It's not a guarantee, but it could tie everything up in probate for years. I don't want that for you. I don't want that for any of us. Just sign the document." I let a beat of silence sit between us. "Scott," I said, "I want you to think carefully about what you're describing. You're telling me that if I don't voluntarily give your mother co-trustee authority over my husband's estate, you're going to file a legal challenge that you yourself are describing as not a guarantee, purely to create problems for me. That's not a legal option. That's a threat." He started to respond, and I talked over him. "I also want you to know that I'm aware of the loans," I said. "The ones secured against the Mallard Creek properties, the ones from the Delaware LLC. I've been doing this work for 6 years, Scott. I know what I'm looking at." The silence on his end was a different quality than the silence before. "I don't know what you think you found," he said slowly. "I think I found what I found," I said, "and I think other people are going to find it too, if they haven't already. I hope everything is in order on your end. I genuinely do." I hung up. I am not going to pretend that was not one of the more satisfying moments of my adult life. 3 days later, Ms. Hope forwarded me an email from Dale informing her that Scott would not be pursuing any legal challenge to James's trust. No explanation was given. The email was 4 sentences long. Patricia called me that same evening. Not the careful, warm voice, not the grief management voice, her actual voice, which I had heard perhaps 3 times in the 8 years I had been married to her son, and which was flat and cold and precise. "You went behind our backs," she said. "I protected myself," I said, "which is what James asked me to do. James is dead." "Yes," I said, "he is. And he still had better judgment about who to trust than either of you gave him credit for." She hung up. The State Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation into Scott's business practices 6 weeks after I submitted the referral package. I know this because a paralegal from the AG's office called me to confirm some of the sourcing in my documentation and to ask if I would be willing to provide a formal statement. I said yes. I want to be honest about what the next several months look like, because I think people expect a story like this to resolve cleanly and quickly, and it does not always do that. There were weeks where I was exhausted and sad and deeply, achingly lonely in the specific way that only happens when you lose a person who was your daily life. There were weeks where I was angry not at Scott or Patricia, but at the whole shape of things, at the fact that the months after my husband's death had been partly consumed by legal maneuvering and financial documentation instead of just grief. But I also want to be honest about the other part. I found a different house. Smaller, on a quiet street in a neighborhood I had always liked, with a backyard that got good afternoon light. I bought it in cash from James's trust. I set up a donor-advised fund and started giving to organizations James had cared about. I took the trip to Portugal that we had talked about for 3 years and never scheduled, and I went alone, and it was one of the hardest and most quietly beautiful weeks of my life. Miss Holt and I eventually transitioned into something closer to a professional relationship. She handles the ongoing trust management, and I consult on a few of her more complex estate cases, which turns out to be a natural extension of what I already knew how to do. As for Scott, the investigation took 11 months. The findings were not minor. The asset inflation scheme was more extensive than what I had initially documented, involving 6 properties and a total of around $400,000 in fraudulent loan proceeds. He was charged with 3 counts of financial fraud and 1 count of making false statements to a financial institution. He took a plea. He lost his real estate license. He is currently on probation and subject to financial monitoring for 5 years. Patricia hired her own attorney and was not charged, though the investigation examined her finances closely for several months, which I understand was not a comfortable experience. She sold the house she and my father-in-law had lived in for 20 years. Whether by necessity or by choice, I do not know. She moved to a smaller apartment outside the city. I have not spoken to her since the night she called me flat and cold and told me James was dead, as though that were a thing I needed to be reminded of. Helen, the aunt with the wine glass and the quiet suggestions, quietly disappeared from my life entirely. No confrontation, no resolution. She simply stopped reaching out, and I did not reach back. I think about James every day. That has not changed, and I do not expect it to. Some days I am at my desk, and something crosses my screen, and I think, he would have had something to say about that, and I feel the specific weight of a conversation I will never get to have. But I also think about the letter. 4 handwritten pages from a man who had been quietly building something for years, so that whoever came for me after he was gone would find me impossible to reach. He could not have known exactly what shape it would take, but he knew enough. He knew me enough. You do not get to choose the family you marry into. You do not get to choose what people reveal about themselves when money and grief get in the same room. But you do get to choose what you do with what you find out. You get to choose who you protect and how you protect them. I chose James even after he was gone, and it turned out that was more than enough. I still think about the moment I stood in that hallway, still in my funeral dress, holding an envelope that changed everything, while my mother-in-law laughed in my own kitchen. I did not burst through the door. I did not scream. I just listened, and I remembered exactly who I was. That is something I want to sit with for a moment, because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. There is a version of me that walks into that kitchen and says everything I was feeling out loud. And honestly, part of me wanted to, but I had spent years learning that the most powerful thing you can do in a moment of betrayal is refuse to hand people the reaction they are counting on. Scott and Patricia had built their entire plan around a version of me that was too broken by grief to think clearly. The second I stayed calm, I stopped being the person they had planned for. That composure was not coldness. It was the first act of protecting myself and James and everything he had quietly built, so that I would never be left without ground to stand on. What James did, those years of careful, quiet building, was an act of integrity so deep it humbled me when I finally understood it. He did not do it to control me or to distrust me. He did it because he believed that the people who love you deserve to be shielded from the worst of what other people are capable of. He saw something in his brother long before I did, and instead of creating drama or confrontation, he simply made sure the door was locked before anything could come through it. That is the kind of moral clarity that does not announce itself. It just works, even after you are gone. I think about the people who tried to take what he left. Scott was not stupid. He was actually quite clever in some ways. But cleverness and genuine intelligence are not the same thing, and I have seen that distinction play out in my work more times than I can count. He built a sophisticated-looking structure out of sloppy fundamentals, and he assumed that because it had survived this long without scrutiny, it would survive indefinitely. What he did not account for was someone who knew exactly where to look and had both the training to find it and the steadiness to use what she found without tipping her hand. The knowledge was not enough on its own. Neither was the calm. Both had to be present at the same time. And learning how to hold them together was the work of years, not days. That is the part I want people to hear, especially if you are in the middle of something that feels impossible and you do not yet know how it ends. The capacity to get through it is not something you find the day you need it. It is something you build slowly through every hard thing you faced before, every time you chose to stay steady when it would have been easier not to, every skill you developed because it interested you, or because it was necessary, or because someone told you that you could, and you decided to believe them. James believed in me before I fully believed in myself, and when the moment came, I did not let him down. I chose Portugal alone, and it was hard and it was beautiful, and both of those things were true at the same time. I think that is what moving forward actually looks like. Not healed, not fixed, just continuing with your eyes open and your feet under you, and the understanding that the people who tried to diminish you have already received exactly what their choices were always going to bring them. You do not have to chase that. You just have to keep going.